Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof, the 18th of November 2024. It's my sister's birthday, I just remembered. Oops, better get onto that. Welcome to another day of pretty significant losses for the Russians across a number of categories, as we can see from the Ukrainian General Staff figures. For the Russian losses for the day before, of course, all the caveats apply to these figures. You can see the caveats listed in the description to the video below. 1,560 personnel lost is an incredibly high number. Still, we have seen over a week now of insane losses of personnel for the Russians. 15 tanks is almost double the daily average there as well. So huge losses in that category. 38 armoured personnel vehicles, likewise, about double the daily average. 30 artillery systems, 107 vehicles and fuel tanks, just a huge loss there. And 2 pieces of special equipment. So, yeah, very high drone and cruise missile losses. That'll be not from last night, but from the night before, obviously. So, challenging numbers for the Russians, that is for sure. Now, I have some Andrew Perpetua loss lists from the 14th, from the 15th, and from the 16th, not for the 17th yet. He's catching up on a huge backlog. I'll go through the 16th, but I will probably do an extra video. I know not all of you are interested, but for those who are interested in me going through these loss lists, I'll check out those two in a very short video after this. So as you can see from the 16th, this is 2 days ago, an awful lot of comms equipment. If you take out that comms equipment for the blue Ukrainian losses, you're left with very few losses, comparatively speaking. Actually, neither side has lost huge amounts of combat asset pieces of equipment, mainly the civilian equipment for the Russians and some ATVs and trucks and whatnot. Of course, we must remember that the Russians are using these civilian vehicles as combat assets. So they are using them to attack positions and get troops from A to B. The troops are light from whether they be Ural trucks or cars, even sometimes golf carts and whatnot. They are using them instead of APCs and IFVs, one presumes, because they don't have enough of those more optimal pieces of equipment. Now, the Ukrainian losses, if we get past the surveillance and comms equipment, as you can see there, taking up the vast majority of that list. Then we get down to a couple of tanks, T-72, T-64, some BMPs as infantry fighting vehicles, old Soviet equipment. 4 of them are, weirdly, as we've seen so much Western equipment listed on the IFVs recently, it's interesting to see just 4 older BMPs there. Some APCs lost and some MRAPs as well, but only 3 in that first category and 2 in the second. Not considerable losses there. Some trucks, ATV, and some civilian vehicles. So not the worst day there for the Ukrainians. Just you could be excused for thinking it's a bad day due to most of it being surveillance and comms equipment. Right, let's get back to the Russian losses and we'll look at their equipment loss, and that includes an air defense system, a Book M1-2, taken out by a Vampire drone. I think that's probably the one. Oh no, it's a Tor I showed you getting taken out by a Vampire drone yesterday. But yeah, they have destroyed another air defense piece of equipment, and we have some artillery pieces. We've got half a dozen tanks there, T-80s, T-72s, 5 infantry fighting vehicles, BMP-1s, and a BTR. And then we're on to trucks. A lot of ATVs, so a lot of golf buggies there destroyed. Could be in that single attack that I showed you the video of, where they were attacking mainly with golf buggies and unarmoured equipment. And then civilian equipment like pickup trucks, cars, motorcycles, all the usuals there. So losing an awful lot of equipment in general, the Russians. But as far as combat asset losses are concerned, far fewer for both sides than we have seen over recent days, particularly from the list I showed you yesterday, the day before. Yesterday. So there were, what was it, 60 IFVs and APCs? Just incredible numbers visually confirmed in a single day. Okay, moving on. I've shown you video footage of drones using nets to drop down above other drones. This is the first bit of footage where we've seen a Russian and a Ukrainian anti-drone drone fighting against each other, and we have, it appears, a Russian net dropping drone dropping a net on a Ukrainian net dropping drone in this cat and mouse game that's taking place there. And you can see it just dropping the net, catching it on the side, and it takes down that drone, and that's the end of that drone. And that'll crash to the floor. End of net dropping drone, and this Russian one gets to go off and fight another day. Interesting. I haven't said this for an awful long time actually, but getting a sense of the pockmarked landscape gives you an idea of the sheer volume of artillery and bombs and mortars that are going off around any given space. Just look at that. Every single one of those is a munition that has exploded. Incredible scenes. Right, moving on. And not too much video footage to show you. I mean, I could show you loads. There's lots out there, but it's just picking the stuff that's particularly marked for one reason or another. Now, there is a hospital on fire in Yekaterinburg. It is another example of Russia on fire. I don't think it's got anything to do with the war particularly, but I haven't shown you this for a long time. This is pretty horrific fire at a hospital in Yekaterinburg where people have ended up jumping out of windows. So it's a pretty major one there. Roof of the city hospital number 3 is on fire in Yekaterinburg. According to eyewitnesses, thick-back smoke can be seen several kilometers away from the fire. The fire covered about 300 square meters, 350 people evacuated, so on and so forth. So we haven't seen that for some time, but another significant fire there in Russia. Now moving on to distance munitions, and it was an important night last night. Let's show you this. So I was talking about this yesterday because I was wondering whether the Russians have stockpiled significant enough cruise missiles, because they've not fired cruise missiles for an awful long time in the numbers that we were once used to. Let's look at Dell's data to give us a sense of. Now, these are only intercepted cruise missiles, so they aren't the total number of cruise missiles that are sent, so always bear that in mind. But if we look at the graph for cruise missiles here, then we can see there's been a huge gap between the last significant attack and the one that we saw not last night but the night before. But in between, there weren't other semi-significant attacks. Like if you look between this large one previously and the one before that was over sort of 60 missiles, you had a couple of nights of heavy missile attacks there. But in between these two, you had regular punctuations of time with fairly significant attacks, sort of 35, 40 missiles being utilized or at least intercepted. Before the previous one to that, there was another big gap as they're stockpiling. So this big gap here, I think, is significant. So they have been stockpiling. Now the question is, have they exhausted their stockpiles? Their stockpiles in 2 nights ago, or had they stockpiled enough? Are they making enough, producing enough of these missiles to carry out significant strikes like 2 nights ago on a consistent basis? And I was worried that last night you would see the same missile attack, but it might take them time to reload things like the ships and submarines. They have to go back to port, get loaded up. There'll only be certain number of loaders down at Novorossiysk. It's not like Sevastopol. They've had to rebuild the provision for loading missiles onto vessels in Novorossiysk. No reports was saying yesterday Russian missile attacks on Ukraine could continue weekly with enough missiles in stock for 5 to 8 more strikes of such size, warns expert Alexander Musyenko. According to him, the threat may persist until the inauguration of US President Donald Trump. This is my worry. Luckily, last night we didn't see that, but it doesn't mean that won't happen tomorrow or, as hinted at here, maybe once a week until inauguration. So you might see these periods of the kind of frequency we saw much earlier in the war taking place over the next 2 months. I don't know, or maybe not. If you don't see that, then it really does tell us that the Russians are only able to produce so many missiles, and they are unable to do what they were doing at the beginning of the war. It could be that their production hasn't really changed throughout the course of the war, but what they were doing at the beginning of the war was using up vast stockpiles that they had just sitting around. Cold War and onwards, where they obviously had huge amounts of missiles in warehouses ready for any given war, maybe enough for sort of 2 or 3 simultaneous conflicts. Well, they used up those missiles and have now been eating into potentially strategic stockpiles of missiles, which means that if they were to engage in another conflict, the Russians simply wouldn't have enough missiles to be able to cope with another conflict. So this was something that Daniela and German Aid to Ukraine were talking about the other day with regard to combat asset pieces, such as new tanks and new infantry fighting vehicles. There's a rumour that the new ones they're making aren't being sent to the front line in Ukraine. They're being put in warehouses because they've exhausted their previous stocks from warehouses. They've got nothing left in case there is a war with NATO or some other conflict that they have to engage in. And they have no strategic stockpiles of that kind of equipment, as well as we're talking about here, missiles. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next few weeks brings in terms of missile strikes from the Russians. But last night, certainly far fewer in both missiles and Shahid drones. So only 11 Shahid drones were sent. That's got to be the lowest for a good long time. 8 out of those 11 were shot down, and 3 more were suppressed by electronic warfare. So that's 100% interception of the Shahids, and then 3 missiles sent, 2 Iskander-Ms and a KH-59-69 missile, cruise missile sent as well. None of those were shot down. They could have ended up hitting Sumy. Sumy was the scene of some pretty horrible strikes last night. 8 dead and 60 plus injured after ballistic missile, could be a North Korean one, attacked on several high-rise buildings in the city of Sumy. Again, just going for civilian infrastructure. Russians are barbaric, it appears. After a ballistic missile attack on a residential building, the death toll in Sumy has risen to 11, including a 9-year-old boy, 14-year-old girl. There are also 68 reported injuries. Overnight, Russia struck critical infrastructure again, leaving the city without power. I imagine they were your children that were killed last night in an act of supposed war rather than, well, actually, just an act of terrorism. It's outright war criminal terrorism. And this is why I get so frustrated when you have people defending Russia. You've had people last night talking about, the escalation of Biden allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles into Kursk region. People like Charlie Kirk and Elon Musk going, and you're like, you are actually on the side of Russia now. There's complete silence on the striking of these buildings, right? Children dying. It's no, let's have a go at Biden for allowing them to use ATACMS, even though the North Koreans have been brought into the war. There's no statement on North Korea. There's no statement on Putin. There's no statement on the disgusting destruction of civilian infrastructure. No, it's Biden. It's slagging off your own leader for allowing Ukraine to strike back at these people. Just insane. There's this insanity going on where there's this growing defense of Russia. It's not so much both sides as like, we just want to stop the war. It's like, we're actively against Ukraine. There's been, and it blows my mind. I don't want to rant again, but I find it actually increasingly disgusting that people are siding overtly with Russia. That there's this, people like Elon Musk are actually criticizing Zelensky. It is unacceptable. Russian Gebera decoy drones imitating Shahid drones are being used to overload Ukrainian air defense. Turned out to be a prototype of a Chinese model aircraft manufacturer, Skywalker Tech Co. Limited. Russia assembles a drone in Alabuga, so that's one of their main their Shahid drone production facilities that has a college nearby where they get loads of younger people to help, loads of college students try and help them build stuff. And that site was hit, some months back by a couple of those plane-sized drones that didn't quite do enough damage to that place as possible. And I've been wondering whether Ukraine are going to hit Alabuga again, because it is a very important facility. But being such an important facility, it's probably now very well protected with air defense and electronic warfare and whatnot. Anyway, Russia assembles a drone in Alabuga using kits imported from China and electronics from 18 Western countries. Wow. During a massive airstrike, not last night, but the night before, and indeed the day before, Russians again targeted the Kremenchuk hydroelectric power station on the Dnipro River. Again, I don't see Elon Musk talking about this. Like, blowing up hydroelectric power station and then, flooding all of that area. That's fine, but Ukrainians using ATACMS 300 kilometers into Russia's totally unacceptable. The last time it was attacked was in October 2022. It's worth noting that destroying it without a major explosion is very difficult. Western Ukraine, a former Ukrainian kindergarten teacher, Natalia Krabarchuk, engages and downs a Russian Kh-101 cruise missile with an Igla manpad. And this kind of talks to the situation for the Ukrainians at the moment, where you've got former kindergarten teachers operating air defense to take down these missiles and drones that are flying at residential buildings, at hydroelectric power stations, so on and so forth. And there she is pretty happy, I think, with... So, good on you. It's a definite change of subject matter to go from teaching phonics to young children to learning to fire at manpads and taking out drones in the middle of the sky. Again, going back to a couple of nights ago, where Ukrainian F-16s were operationalized to go and shoot down the cruise missiles and drones that were sweeping through the Ukrainian skies. So they intercepted about 10 targets in Russia's morning missile attack. That was pretty good. I think about 8 F-16s maybe could have been up in the air. I think it's about as many as they've got. Ukraine intercepted 102 of 120 missiles and 42 of 90 drones. Of course, there's a lot more taken out by electronic warfare as well. That was that couple of nights ago. Now, Jay in Kyiv says, and he's in quite a ranty mood at the moment, this is what Ukraine accomplishes with just 8 F-16s. Imagine if they had 100. NATO countries have 4,000 of these old planes sitting around collecting dust. And of course, the bottleneck's going to be in training those pilots. But yeah, there are a number of F-16s that I can imagine would be very much appreciated by the Ukrainians at the moment. They are receiving more as time goes by from the Nordic states and elsewhere, but it seems painfully slow. Tim White now talks about the potential targets taken out by Ukrainian drones inside Russia last night. Most of the activity seems to have been in Bryansk region. Tim White says it's loud in parts of Russia tonight. Only drones, not ATACMS or Storm Shadows yet, but the Kremlin claims to have shot down 26 attack drones in Bryansk region, while another drone also reached Moscow region. Video shows allegedly one being allegedly shot down in the top of the screen. The war translator says the Russians claim that their air defences shot down 59 Ukrainian drones overnight in the end, including 2 over the Moscow region. So 45 drones were reportedly downed over Bryansk region. So as the night went on, more and more drones claimed to have been shot down. Don't know. I would be very surprised if all 45 drones were shot down and they did a good job, but that's what Ukraine is doing to Russia's attack drones at the moment. So you never know. But it's usually the case that the Russians claim that they intercept all 100% of the Ukrainian drones, but the reality is that they don't, and there are successful strikes. So we may see more information emerging throughout the day. And just to give you a little bit more information on a strike by the Ukrainians, not last night but previously, that's 1,500 kilometers from the border. At Izhevsk, and I mentioned this, Ukraine conducts first ever strike on a major Russian arms hub in Udmurtia. Drone strikes reportedly damaged a military factory there, shattering windows and allegedly injuring one person at a drone production site. So that's sort of similar to the Alabuga facility I was talking about. I don't know if any serious damage was done there. These are the sorts of strikes where you need like 100 drones to be targeting the very same place. In order to make sure that something gets through. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces, and really going to concern ourselves entirely, almost entirely, with the news about the ATACMS being, having their restrictions lifted, as according to Biden, and, well, at least according to, I don't know whether these are leaks, whether these are purposeful or not. So whenever you hear, like, here is a spokesperson who's anonymous on account of sensitive subject matter, and you're thinking, that's not a leak, that is someone telling you because they've been drafted to do so by the DOD or whatever. But then you wonder, what is the point of communicating this, telegraphing this to the Kremlin? I know this has happened throughout the war, but I'm always unsure as to whether that's wise. Like, why are you telling the Kremlin that you are going to lift restrictions? Just let the data speak for itself. Oh, there are ATACMS that struck that airbase and you weren't ready for it. Oh yeah, we've lifted, by the way, forgot to tell you, we lifted restrictions. Didn't we tell you? Oh, sorry about that. Anyway, your planes are blown up now. Rather than going, we're going to lift restrictions, just make sure you move your planes quickly before Ukraine actually get to shoot at them. We're lifting restrictions now. Oh, there's nothing there to hit. Oh well. But anyway, so the Biden administration has supposedly lifted restrictions on ATACMS to be, it seems, only on ATACMS and only to be used in the Kursk region. So the US official, who wasn't authorized to speak publicly about the decision, said the US is allowing Ukraine to use the weapons to target in and around Kursk, the same region where the 10,000 North Korean troops were recently deployed. So some people on my thread last night when I did my breaking news update were saying, how do you know it's only Kursk? I can't see this anywhere. It was what was reported in NPR and New York Times. Like, the source that is telling us that the restrictions have been lifted is the same source that's saying only in Kursk. So it does appear to be Kursk, but whether that is something that will change going forward or whether it's 100% accurate, I can't tell you. Axios reports ATACMS were only authorized for use in the Kursk area where North Korean troops have been deployed. So what this was is a reaction to North Korea. This isn't something that would have happened anyway. This appears to be that when Blinken said recently, Antony Blinken, on behalf of the Biden administration, said recently that there was going to be a firm response to North Korean troops being used in Kursk. This is that firm response. So the motivation behind the decision was to deter North Korea from sending more troops to Russia for the war against Ukraine. I don't think this will make the blindest bit of difference as to whether North Korea will send troops or not. I don't know that Ukraine has enough ATACMS to absolutely hammer the crap out of just the Kursk area itself. Because not only do you need a lot of missiles anyway, because there are a lot of targets, but for each target, you need to be sending even more missiles because the interception rate of these is quite good now for the Russians. The Russians end up taking out ATACMS much more easily than they did when they were first introduced. So you need a load of ATACMS to make sure that you are hitting and destroying the targets that you need to. Now, here is this from the New York Times article? Yeah. So Biden allows Ukraine to strike Russia with long-range US ATACMS. Unfortunately, this comes too late, and as usual, it has to be spread through the media, which denies Ukraine a tactical advantage of surprise, half committed until the end, and I generally agree with that. But a couple of quotes from the article. Officials said Mr. Biden was persuaded to make the change in part by the sheer audacity of Russia's decision to throw North Korean troops at Ukrainian lines. I don't think this is big enough. Like, if they're sending troops and self-propelled howitzers and multiple launch rocket systems, then a few ATACMS into Kursk isn't good enough. I think it should just be like ATACMS, go for it, and Storm Shadows and Scalp and anything else. We're still a little bit unsure about Scalp and Storm Shadows. So anyway, we'll come on to that. But they said Mr. Biden determined that the potential benefits Ukraine will be able to reach certain high-value targets that it would not otherwise be able to do, and the United States will be able to send a message to North Korea that it will pay a significant price for its involvement, outweigh the escalation risk. Of course, they need to provide enough ATACMS to be able to take out all of those North Korean troop concentrations. But then the question is, well, if North Korea gets all their troops taken out by those missiles, will that spur North Korea on to provide even more? Will that be escalatory for North Korea? So, yeah, the US will now allow Ukraine to strike Russian territory. Zelensky's response was the missiles will speak for themselves. So he's not saying yes, not saying no, but let the data speak for itself, which is kind of an implicit yes. New York Times and Washington Post reported that US President Biden's authorized that those strikes, limited strikes against Russian and North Korean military targets within Kursk. So the ISW says the partial lifting of restrictions on Ukraine's use of Western-provided long-range weapons against military objects within Kursk will not completely deprive Russian forces of their sanctuary in Russian territory, as hundreds of military objects remain within ATACMS range in other Russian border regions. ISW continues to assess that Russian forces will benefit from any partial sanctuary if Western states continue to impose restrictions on Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Absolutely right. And that the US should allow Ukraine to strike all legitimate military targets within Russia's operational and deep rear within range of US-provided weapons, not just those in Kursk or Blast. So the ISW being very strong in their criticism of that decision, although it's good news, it's better. This is good, but it's not great. Now, Jane Kiev, I think, misinterprets this. So Jane Kiev says Biden apparently will continue to block France and the UK from allowing Ukraine to use their missiles, so the Storm Shadows and the Scalp EGs. It's incredible the weakness of this old man. Thousands of lives it costs. I'm actually not sure it definitely says that. So this is Jürgen Naudit saying the US could not give consent to use the Storm Shadows missiles supplied by Ukraine. On the territory of Russia, according to the Times. ATACMS missiles, which Biden allowed to be used for strikes on the Russian Federation, have different military characteristics compared to Storm Shadow missiles. This could mean that the US has yet to give consent to the use of Storm Shadow, despite private requests from the government, the article said. Now, pay attention to the modals there. Like could, that's a probability. It's not a definite. So be careful when, and that includes myself, when I read what people's opinions are. You know, Biden apparently will continue to block. No, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say Biden will continue to block. Even apparently will continue to block. It says very clearly, well, first of all, Jürgen Naudit says it could mean that the US has yet to give consent. So that's a very different thing. It's not blocking. It's that they haven't lifted restrictions. It's not like they are saying we are going to block that, but it could mean they're yet to lift consent. And actually, if we go to the source article, it says this might mean that the US will still not authorize the use of Storm Shadows despite private requests from the government. So there's still total modal language going on in the source article. So it's not they won't be allowed to use. Actually, there's just not enough information to cast an opinion either way. Downing Street sources say that ATACMS being authorized by Biden had different military specifications to Storm Shadow missiles. We just don't know yet. I mean, yeah. Again, there's this argument going on, or discussion as to why Storm Shadows and Scalp EG aren't allowed to be used. You know, what is it the US that's stopping them being used? I'd say almost certainly yes. And then what's the rationale behind that? Is it anti-escalation, or is it there are lots of reasons that have been touted, such as they will require a level of intelligence from satellite imagery and targeting that is problematic for the US to supply to Ukraine. There's geofencing. There's all a number of different reasons as to why they might not be able to use them, as well, kind of export, licensing, and I don't know, all sorts of other reasons. But I think all of that's kind of a load of nonsense. If the US really wanted Ukraine to use those missiles, then Ukraine could use those missiles. Now, the reactions are really interesting to the decision, to lift restrictions. It's very obvious what people like other dictators around the world think. So Venezuelan dictator Maduro calls Zelensky a Nazi criminal and criticizes the approvals for strikes deep into Russia. Quote, the governments of the US, France and UK have just approved the Nazi criminal Zelensky to use long-range missiles against our brotherly Russia. Okay, so if you are your bog standard American member, the bog standard American citizen, you're like, okay, I'm pretty sure Russia should be the bad guys, but I'm not too sure anymore because there's all conflicting data going on. But Venezuela, most people are agreeing that Venezuela are the bad guys. And as for anyone interested in the war in Ukraine, you're going to be like, yeah, Orban is definitely not good for Ukraine. So my opinions probably shouldn't align with Venezuela, and in this case, the foreign minister of Hungary today lambasted the US for authorizing Ukraine to strike targets inside Russia using American-supplied long-range missiles. Okay, so if I'm an American who's aligning myself with Venezuela, Viktor Orban and Shihato, as someone told me, I think that's correct, and also really Russia, like the Russian reaction to this, if my opinion aligns to that, then I'm probably on the wrong side. So it's really weird that Elon Musk says the problem is that Russia will respond reciprocally. So he's calling into question the lifting of restrictions. So Elon Musk not condemning the strikes on Sumy, but having a go at the US for allowing Ukraine to strike back, right? And then we've got Charlie Kirk, who was in charge of, with Turning Point USA, was in charge of campaigning for the Republican Party. So these are people, you got Elon Musk right in the middle of the administration, incoming administration. You got Charlie Kirk, really a huge component of the GOP campaign, says Biden is trying to start World War III. This is pathological and totally insane. US weaponry should not be used to fire into the interior of Russia, ! Imagine if Russia supplied missiles to fire into America. So what's really interesting is, as War Monitor points out, Charlie Kirk, why do you support unlimited foreign aid spending for Israel? So Israel can fire into Iran, right? And you can provide, and you support the provision of weapons for that, but not Ukraine. What's the difference, and how is Ukraine not more of a net benefit? The Ukrainian army has destroyed over 3,000 tanks and limited the Russian navy to its warm water port. To its warm water port in Novorossiysk, so it's moved it out of Sevastopol. So I don't understand, and War Monitor is correctly questioning here the double standards of people who are going out of their way to criticize Zelensky and going out of their way to criticize the provision of missiles to Ukraine from Biden. Sorry, that was Ivan to my side saying we run out of milk from a cup of tea. It's absolutely insane that people are going to be criticizing Zelensky and the Ukrainians for trying to stop Russians destroying residential buildings, bombing residential buildings, and taking out Kharkiv and so on and so forth. The criticisms are leveled at Ukraine and the US for supporting Ukraine, and the criticisms are completely absent with regard to Russia and North Korea. And yet you allow weapons to be provided to Israel. Just honestly, if you still support these guys, I don't know how you can support Ukraine and the incoming Trump administration, because it is clear that they are siding very explicitly with Russia. Now, Russia, if you're talking about the proposed peace plan, if the J.D. Vance plan or the Kellogg and Flights plan is something that you think is not only doable but likely, we've got Peskov, the spokesperson for Kremlin, saying Russia rejects a kind of frozen conflict along the front line. The conditions set by President Putin for halting hostilities remain unchanged. Now, that could be a bit of... I do wonder whether they'll say, "Oh, we'll never allow for that. This is absolutely not acceptable to the Kremlin to allow frozen lines and a frozen conflict and demilitarized zone, blah blah blah." It could be they're playing games here. It could be that that's absolutely fine for them, and so therefore, when they agree to that, it's almost as if they're going. They've really worked hard to compromise. Actually, they're fine with it. There could be that kind of game going on. Or this could be genuine that, thank you so much, Ivan. This could be absolutely genuine that this is unacceptable for the Russians, in which case the proposed peace plans are a no-go. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Kremlin spokesperson, the option of freezing a war in Ukraine along the line of control is unacceptable to Russia. And it's not just that. Obviously, there are all these stipulations about NATO, etc., etc. Now, it's also important to note that Erdogan has come out. So the Turkish leader has come out and said he proposes a freezing of the front lines and Ukraine not to join NATO for 10 years. So you're starting to get more and more world leaders coming together and being for this forced negotiation. And I'm sorry, but all those proposals would benefit Russia more than Ukraine. There's no doubt about it in my mind. And it breaks my heart that I think Ukraine is being betrayed by the US. It really does. Okay, so the story out by the AP, Associated Press, talking about fighting on the front line, is a bit more of a balanced piece. As quite often we see total doom articles, but actually it's quite nice to see an article here in the AP saying Russia grinds deeper into Ukraine after 1,000 days of a grueling war, which is pretty aligned with how I think the war is going, which is that, yes, the Russians are making these gains, but it's coming at huge cost to them. And actually it's also important to get a sense of the context of the 3 years of war. Look at where the front lines are now compared to in, I don't know, March, April, May of 2022, where the Russians were knocking on the door of Kiev, of Sumy, of Kharkiv cities, right outside, lobbing projectiles into those cities, and they had much more of the map of Ukraine. And then Ukraine managed to beat the Russians back a lot further. And broadly speaking, it's been somewhat static, although the Russians are making these accelerated gains over the last month or so. But it is still far less than where they were at sort of 2 years ago. So it's worth remembering that. But also, yes, the Ukrainians are under the cosh a lot on those front lines. As this brutal war of attrition grinds towards its 1,000th day, neither side seems eager to negotiate. President-elect Donald Trump has said he could quickly end the war, though it's unclear how or in whose favour he might tip the scales. This backdrop appears to be driving Russia's strategy in eastern Ukraine, according to Felix O'Brien, a professor of strategic studies at University of St Andrews, Scotland. Trump could try to force an end to the war by halting the supply of weapons to Ukraine, he said. Quote, if Trump cuts aid to Ukraine and a ceasefire leads to a frozen conflict, Russia wants to secure as much territory as it can now, O'Brien said. So I think you've got this situation where they are throwing everything at the Ukrainians to try and take as much land, just in case negotiations are forced upon them. And then, remembering the course of this war. So the war's first year, Ukraine lost huge amounts of territory, but also achieved notable victories. It resisted a much larger adversary with superior air power to survive as an independent country, and it reclaimed some land through gutsy counteroffensives, giving the underdog and its wealthy allies the confidence to stay in a fight. In the second year, which was punctuated by Ukraine's devastating loss of Bakhmut and its failed counteroffensive, the armies essentially fought to a standstill along a 1,000-kilometre front line. Toward the end of the year, US Congress delayed the approval of $61 billion aid package of weapons, economic and humanitarian assistance. That was 7 months lost there. With Ukraine's ammunition dwindling, its outlook deteriorated significantly as the war's third year began. In February 2024, the town of Avdiivka fell after months of airstrikes by Russia, which used highly destructive Soviet-era bombs retrofitted with navigation systems. So we could, I don't want to play the blame game here, but you got the GOP Trump that put an end to, because it wasn't the GOP, it wasn't the Republicans as a whole, it was the MAGA Trump portion of the party that put an end to that $61 billion aid package for 7 months. And it's the same people that are coming into power now and are blaming Zelensky for everything and are not blaming Russia for anything and are seeking a forced negotiation. So I think the writing is pretty obviously on the wall. I think it's obvious which side, at least prima facie, that the incoming administration are going to favour. And unless Russia plays it badly, then this will not be to the favour of Ukraine. But anyway, the article goes on to talk about how huge amounts of losses have taken place. At Kursk happened after the fall of Avdiivka, and you got this these swings, these highs and lows of what happened throughout the war. And we're in this situation now where there is a very static front line that's incredibly attritional. While the amount of land Russia's gained in 2024, about 2,455 square kilometers, is equal to less than 1% of Ukraine's pre-war territory, it is having a psychological impact. With Ukrainian retreat, quote, "We've now returned to the period reminiscent of the war's first month," says Mykola Bieliskov, an analyst from CBA Initiative Center in Kyiv. This strengthens Russia's position, not so much militarily, but in terms of morale. To keep its war machine going, Russia, like Ukraine, has turned it to allies for help. Iran supplies Russia with drones and possibly missiles. North Korea sent ammunition and even troops. And now we know materiel who have been deployed to Russia's Kursk region. And Russian President Putin claimed this year that 700,000 of his troops are fighting in Ukraine. Analysts say Putin would need a much larger force to accelerate Russia's advance, but that is unlikely to. He is unlikely to mobilize more troops because it could stoke internal discontent. And that's kind of where we are. There is this idea that Ukraine are in a lot of trouble, but also Russia are not looking good either. But bravery, heroism and spirit are not enough, said a Ukrainian soldier in the eastern Donetsk region. The soldier estimated that where he is stationed, Russian infantry outnumber Ukrainian troops 10 to 1. As the war drags on and death toll rises, it has become increasingly difficult for Ukrainian President Zelensky to keep replacing troops. I think that's the same for both sides. And so we're at a stage where, it's deeply, deeply frustrating that Ukraine hasn't been able to overcome mass with precision. And by precision, I mean precisely striking Russian targets deep within Russian territory. That we just had this change of decision now, and that is months and months and months and months too late. Really, really frustrating. But yeah, we're at a point where this war could go either way. It depends on the assistance given by other by allies, and decisions made by the leaders of each country. Like mobilization. What's either side going to do about mass mobilization? It seems to be an issue that is so poisonous for each leader that they're afraid to do it. Right. Just a note on my breaking news update last night. Just to remind people, I am only a single human being, right? And last night was Sunday night, and the news broke, and I was out at a comedy gig in my local town. JP finally reporting on this breaking news so that the restrictions were lifted. This news was out since 6 hours ago. I've been searching your channel on an hourly basis for detailed analysis. I'm sorry. I am just a single human and I work insanely hard and I have very little life outside of this. So when I do go and experience a bit of life, I'm like, why weren't you doing a video? I did it as soon as I got back, near enough midnight. So hey ho. Oh well, there it is. I try my hardest, guys. Thanks anyway for your support. Really appreciate it. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.